Okay, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all on Zoom, although I would much rather we were doing this in person. My name is Nina Lopez, and I will I will be chairing this webinar, which is really more of a speak out than a webinar. I'm a founder of Legal Action for Women, which coordinates the Support Not Separation Coalition. SNS includes a number of organizations based at the Multiracial Crossroads Women's Centre in London, as well as the Psychotherapy Union and others who are outraged that children are being removed from their mothers. Also the Scottish Kinship Care Alliance. Everything we do is based on collective self-help, on bringing together mothers, sometimes grandmothers and aunties, who are struggling to keep or regain their children, with the grassroots organizations at the Crossroads Women's Centre. We work together in a mutually accountable way to win our cases and to advance our campaigning so we can end this injustice for all of us. Through the Global Women's Strike and Women of Color in the Global Women's Strike, which are also part of our coalition, we have an international network. And tonight, for the first time, our sister organization in the US will be speaking about their work there, and we are particularly excited about that. We share the same perspective in the UK, in the US, that is, the need to value and protect the bond between mother and child, because overwhelmingly it is the mother or another family caregiver who is the child's first protector. This bond is increasingly under attack from the state, from violent men backed by the state, and from the lucrative child protection and adoption industry, which are also backed by the state. We demand that the millions that are lavished on that industry to remove children must be paid instead to mothers and other family caregivers, because only then will we stop this mass removal of children. And only then will we be able to raise our children without fear, trauma, and criminalization. When we started in the US and later in the UK, practically no one knew that the state was removing children in their tens of thousands every year. And if we put together the children in the UK with the children in the US, it probably comes to millions. And it's especially from low-income single mother families who are often women of color or women with a disability, and especially if are also victims of domestic violence. A movement of mothers and families on both sides of the Atlantic, including our monthly health pickets of the Family Court in London, which we've held for some years now, has forced this truth out into the open. At the same time, survivors of historic crimes against children in Australia, Britain, Ireland, Spain, North and South America have forced governments to apologize for mass removals and even murders. I come from Argentina, where the military dictatorship stole the children of the pregnant women they murdered to be raised by military families. So I have a good sense of how far back and how deep all this goes. This is a long and gory story. And by putting the pieces together, we strengthen all our movements for justice. So today we launch new research based on our extensive casework, facts and figures that validate our experiences. And we launched a guide we have developed as part of our collective self-help for mothers going through the family courts in England and Wales. And our children and our sisters in California are also launching a guide, and we'll speak about that. As I said, this is more of a speak out than a webinar. So everyone will have 3 minutes, and I will try to be strict about that, Hopefully, with everyone's help, we can make it work. Afterwards, there will be time for contributions from the floor, so please put your questions and comments in the chat. So I will go straight to our first speaker, who is Anne Neal of Legal Action for Women and Support Not Separation, and is the co-author of the dossier Suffer the Little Children and Their Mothers. And she will speak on our latest research based on our extensive casework.
Hi everybody. We published our dossier, Suffer the Little Children and Their Mothers, in 2017, based on the experiences of just over 50 mothers. Soon after, we started having monthly pickets outside the family court and monthly self-help meetings. Lots more mothers, plus some grannies, aunties, and families got in touch, and the statistics we're releasing today are based on 219 mothers with 411 children. So I'm going to just tell you what the research says. The overwhelming majority, 94% of the women, were single mothers, mostly on low incomes. At least 76% of these had reported domestic violence, which was up from 71% in 2017. It shows that once women leave a violent partner, they are punished by the state system that shields the perpetrator rather than the mother and the children she is struggling to protect. And we'll be hearing more about that shortly. Nearly all were fighting over contact with their children. They were trying to stop violent fathers having unsafe, unsupervised contact, or trying to re-establish contact with children who had been given to the father, or were in foster care as a result of hostile social workers and judges. Over half the mothers had their children taken from them, which was a significant increase from 2017. In 30% of the cases, the children were living with the abusive father, and 14% had children who were in foster care, and 10% had children adopted without their consent. This shocking figure gives lie to the idea that forced adoptions are historic. They are, in fact, a present-day policy of punishment and social cleansing. 44% were women of color and/or immigrant women who faced both sexism and racism. 44% of mothers had mental health issues, also shockingly high, especially when we know that much of it was caused by or exacerbated by family court proceedings, often lasting many years, and that the more mums are traumatized by having their children removed, the more it's used against them. 19% had a physical disability, and this was used against them. It's clear from our research that women's low incomes, our need for support to escape violent men and/or deal with a disability, including mental health issues caused by abusive fathers and an abusive family court system, all are used to accuse mothers of, quote, neglect or causing, quote, emotional harm and remove our children. It reflects the harsh reality of increasing state intrusion into family life, particularly of low-income families headed by women, the devaluing of the crucial bond between mother and child, and the undue influence of the male supremacist father's lobby. It was a big victory when the UK Ministry of Justice's harm report found that women face a number of barriers to reporting abuse in the family courts, including their, quote, sexism, racism, and classism. This supported all our experiences. It's great that the movement of mothers and campaigners is growing on both sides of the Atlantic, determined to end state-sanctioned child abuse and to get the financial and other support we need to care for and protect our children. Please do look at our blog. Please join our monthly pickets of the family court, which are on Twitter during lockdown, but in London we'll be restarting in September, and join our campaigning. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Anne. Our next speaker is Noura Hamid, who is part of our Mother Self-Help Group and One Against Parental Alienation and Racism.
Yeah. So if my experience can give insight into if my experience can give insight into the reality of the family court system and gives hope to at least one mum out there to not give up, then it will have been worth it. My children are now aged 12 and 13. 5 years ago, I finally walked out of an abusive marriage. It was emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. I thought I had taken the bravest step of my life, but the biggest struggle lay ahead as the family courts listened to my ex-husband's false accusations of parental alienation. I had left an abuser, and the children and I ended up in more danger. How was that even possible? I didn't want to go to court. My ex-husband started proceedings and kept on taking us back with new application after application, full of false accusations, even up to the night of the last hearing. Finally, he got caught out.
Okay.
It was 4 tough years in court with over 15 hearings, and it cost me over £200,000. The courts finally listened to the children and gave them the protection they needed. We got a tight order at last. Their dad was barred from taking us back to court and from seeing the children until they are ready to see him again. This came, I believe, because we didn't give up. My hair turned grey. I lost weight. I had to borrow to pay the lawyers. There were days I didn't want to come out from beneath my duvet. How could someone still control you from a distance and continue their abuse through the very courts that were meant to protect us? Why were experts in CAFCAS always ready to support the dad? I was told by lawyers not to raise the subject of domestic abuse. Nobody wanted to hear the mother's voice. Nobody respected the mother's opinion. One judge in Slough shouted at me. She said, "What do you know? You're just a mother." They threatened to take the children into care, and I was utterly broken. I felt I had no rights to speak up. The children had to retell their sad experiences over and over again to a multitude of social workers and experts. 2 years ago, I read an article about mothers being falsely accused of parental alienation and how SNS wanted to support mothers and children where fathers had used PA as a tool to continue their abuse. Nicola, Anne and Tracy believed me when CAFCAS and the courts had not, despite all the evidence. My ex played the court system, the social workers and the experts. He wooed the CAFCAS officers and judges, changed courts, contested orders and charmed social workers with homemade, freshly baked pastries and lies. A psych report commented that I had worn my hijab throughout my parenting interview. But what did my hijab have to do with my parenting skills? My husband was English and my parental roots were Asian. Experts believed my husband blindly and accused me of leaving the children culturally deficient. Even though there were court instructions to investigate domestic abuse, the psych report omitted to investigate. For surely a charming middle-class father that bakes fresh pastries for the CAFCAS guardian can't be abusive, can he? I'm starting to heal, having been in high alert mode for over 5 years. I now watch the children growing up happily, no more fear. They are in the care of a mother who loves them and fought hard to protect them, and that gives me peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Noura. Thank you very much. It's so good to win, and it's such an encouragement for all of us. Okay, our next speaker is Tracy Norton, who fought for years to protect her child and volunteers with Support Not Separation and with Visible's Disabled Mothers Project, which helps many other mothers to fight their cases. Go ahead, Tracy.
Thank you, Nina. The self-help guide we're launching today, protecting our children, defending our rights, is something I wish had been available to me when I was struggling to keep my disabled child from being taken from us. It's the product of lots of women's experiences with social services and the family courts, and I'm very pleased that my own experiences have been useful to it. The issues it raises have come up in our monthly self-help mums meetings and in discussions with lawyers, social workers, and other professionals that mums have had to deal with. When I was being dragged through the family courts, my first realization that I was in trouble was when my lawyers called me the day before my first court hearing and told me I'd lost. Shocked, I said, but I haven't given my evidence yet. The lawyers explained that the judge I was up against hates mothers with medical cases, and no matter what I said, he would rule against me. I should shut up and stay quiet. I could have done with a guide at this point, not just to guide me through the family court's biased and secret process, but to understand my rights so I could deal with my own lawyers. The guide goes through what happens when you're fighting the state trying to take your children, and when you're fighting against abusive fathers wanting unsafe contact or residency of the children. We go through mothers' rights at every stage, including the right to support under Section 17 of the Children's Act 1989 and the Care Act 2014, and the right not to get pushed into child protection just because we asked for help. We've got a section on top tips, and the US guide helped us greatly with this, where we make suggestions about key things you should know and helpful tactics. For example, when you're in a meeting with social workers, always let them speak first so that you already know their position, what their position is, and you can tailor your response. Also, never meet them alone and record every conversation. The guide is a work in progress as we come up against different situations. We find out something that we didn't know before, some tactics that are particularly helpful, and as the law changes, we will add it to the guide. When you read it, if you see something that has been left out or needs explaining, please let us know. The guide is also an important tool for Win Visible's Disabled Mothers' Rights campaign, which I'm part of, to highlight the struggles of disabled mothers and making information more accessible. The guide aims to strengthen mothers like me so that we can take charge of our own cases and get the support we need to win. If I'd had it years ago, the outcome of my case would have been extremely different. Today, working together with the guide, we are winning many of our own cases. It's an important part of changing the climate so we can stop the terrible injustices that we are up against once and for all. Thank you, Nina.
Thank you very much, Tracy. Our next speaker is Shola Raquel from Women of Color in the Global Women's Strike. She will actually read the speech by Jenny Spencer, a mother from our self-help group who couldn't be with us today. Please, Shola, go ahead.
So I used to be independent, a psychotherapist. I set up a support charity, and I'm a good mum to 2 beautiful children. I was in good health, both psychologically and physically. I was not known to children's services, and there were never any concerns around myself, my parenting, or my children. At the age of 35 and only 6 months into my marriage with my abuser, my life had descended into chaos and I had to flee to a women's refuge. I had been abused in a variety of ways. The worst was having been raped on multiple occasions, 2 of which resulted in pregnancy. One pregnancy was terminated and the other, my 6-year-old son, is the reason for current family court proceedings. The refuge encouraged me to contact social services. This was a mistake. It would seem that being a victim of crime and taking the necessary steps to protect yourself and children can become a reason for ongoing safeguarding suspicion, and I ended up being accused of child neglect. I fought back when this happened and used the complaints procedure, which has taken me years, but I did manage to have all my 30 complaints upheld, as social services had not investigated properly, and my child was found later to be hearing impaired. They had not taken my condition into account and how the stress they were causing was not helping my fatigue, and I was sensory overloaded. They agreed that they had misunderstood my overload, but the damage was done. As a result of this experience, any professionals I come into contact with, for example, via the nursery or school, treat me with suspicion because they know about social services being involved. Despite not having parental responsibility and there so far not being a fact finding to determine my allegations of rapes and forced pregnancy, which relates to the child in question, my rapist, his father, has so far through the courts requested and had to access my medical records and our child's social care records. It should be about my child's rights and not the alleged abusers, at least until the facts have been determined. The stress of all this aggravated my illness and I became a wheelchair user. It has also cost me financially. Negatives about me held on record, for example, that I was a troubled young lady, were used in family courts, but the positives and the truthful accounts were withheld, making it seem like I was a distressed person who could not cope with my children. My reactions were not seen as a result of the trauma and abuse I had suffered. My child could be potentially harmed by decisions made by the family court. It's been great being part of the Support Not Separation Self-Help Mums group because I know now that I'm not alone in this fight.
Thank you very much, Shoda. I now call on Nicola Mann from Women Against Rape, which is also a member of the Support Not Separation Coalition. Nicola.
Thanks, Nina. Rape and domestic violence are described by the government, the police and prosecutors as really terrible and serious crimes, but what they say is all PR. Because the proof is that both crimes have practically been decriminalised. Women don't get the protection and resources that we need when we're trying to escape. And although the women's movement has won some victories in the criminal court, it's like the family courts are still stuck in the 70s when rape in marriage was not a crime. As Anne reported, 76% of the women who contact us are victims of domestic violence and they're trying to protect their children. Already traumatised by the abuse they suffered, they're abused again in the family court, which often sides with the father, even when he's a convicted rapist. When fathers deny being violent, they say that the mother is lying, that they're a victim of parental alienation, that they're being denied the chance of being a dad. Social services and judges then accuse mothers of causing future emotional harm to the children and force them to have contact or even live with a father they are terrified of. Many children are ignored or manipulated into going into contact, and some who refuse are threatened with being taken into care. The women's movement has won some protections for victims of domestic violence going through the courts, but they're rarely implemented. Even mothers' own lawyers often tell them not to raise the violence because if they do, they'll lose their kids. If you disclose violence to the court, a fact-finding hearing might be ordered. And this compromises of one single judge deciding whether you've been raped or abused, and that's outrageous, especially when some judges have made comments such as, sometimes we're just not in the mood for sex, or that it couldn't be rape because the woman didn't fight back. In fact-finding hearings, mothers are only allowed to raise 5 allegations, which makes it almost impossible for you to prove coercive control. But despite all this, we have turned around several cases. In one, the court had already decided that the father's violence wasn't relevant to the proceedings and the mother was accused of parental alienation. We worked to ensure that the violence was raised. And faced with the evidence that the father had also raped another child, the judge had to agree that he was dangerous and stop all contact. But how many other children are forced to live with a father who rapes and abuses them? Despite our campaigning on the Domestic Abuse Act, the government have refused to end or even limit the presumption of contact that fathers use to persecute children and their mothers. Violence against women and children isn't just down to individual men. It's a policy of the criminal justice system. Politicians who deny legal protections, the judges who back violent fathers, and the police and the councils who cover up rape and abuse of thousands of children, like in Rochdale and Rotherham. The government's police bill would increase police powers against all kinds of protests. As women speaking out against rape, racism and murder and picketing the family courts every month in defence of our children, we are among those targeted. But the floodgates of protest have opened and there isn't any going back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicola. Okay, our next speaker is Lubna Patel, who is the founder of Soul Sisters in Manchester, also a member of the Support Not Separation Coalition.
Hello, I'm Lubna, founder and chair of Soul Sisters Empowering People. Yes, I'm a British Bangladeshi single mum and I live in Rochdale in Manchester. I am on Universal Credit. I'm also a survivor of domestic abuse. Now, our charity helps a number of mothers and a large number of mums are part of from the BAME community. And I help with the family court proceedings when they going through the proceedings or when social workers are involved or CAFCAS is involved. And what I have found with mums that I've helped is that if they say that they have a mental health problem because of the abuse that they've gone through, then immediately they are called crazy, that they're not fit to look after their children and that they're alienating the children by behaving like that. Also, I've had issues where a mother, a mum of colour, she has language barrier, she doesn't understand English. However, no court bundles were sent to her through the whole court proceedings that she was going through. And she was shouting on top of her voice about sexual abuse, rape, but no one was listening to her. Eventually, her kids got access to the perpetrator. She didn't get legal aid offered to her when she should have been on legal aid. Another mother, her son was taken off her to a foster family. Again, another mum of colour. Sorry about the background noise. Another mum of colour. Her children were taken off. Her son was taken off her to fostering. And when she was allowed to see the son had told her that he wasn't being looked after properly. He was left in the room alone. He was being given non-halal food. When she brought this up in court, the judge called her as being hostile and causing trouble. Another mother who was having a social worker involved in her case, another mum of colour, she's Bangladeshi. The social worker, so this case, the perpetrator there was a lot of evidence against him. 21 years of abuse. He was on bail. She told the social worker she's going to be applying for some court, court orders. The social worker went and told the perpetrator everything, told her family everything, and her family were trying to force her to get back with this perpetrator. So then she was getting backlash from the perpetrator and her family. Why are you applying for these court orders? So the social workers do not listen to mums if they're victims of domestic abuse. Straight away, there's a label, you're a victim, you don't know what you're talking about. And also fathers use the court system. I'm finished now, I think. That's my 3 minutes, sorry. I've just timed myself.
Thank you very much for that. That was great that you timed yourself. I was just about to tell you. That was very good. Thank you. Our next speaker is Jean Evely, a mother with a disability whose child was adopted against her wishes. Please, Jean.
Thank you, Nina. My case started in 2002 when I found out I was pregnant after being told that I would never be able to conceive a child naturally. I was disabled and alone and wasn't sure how I would manage. So I asked for a social worker because I thought that their job was to support parents, especially disabled parents, to be able to look after their children themselves. I was so very, very wrong. For the remaining 4 months of my pregnancy, I was being forced to have an abortion. I refused. My daughter was born and they instantly wanted to remove her from me. It took them 12 weeks to find enough grounds to be able to take her from me. And I spent the next 2.5 years in court trying to keep her. Having 2 assessments where my physical needs were completely ignored and only my mental health was being assessed. In one of the assessments, my daughter by this time was a toddler and I was told that I wouldn't be able to use my crutches to mobilise because if I did, I wouldn't be able to hold her hand or run after her or in any way be able to look after her while she was walking. So I had to choose between my daughter's health and needs and my physical health. I didn't use my crutches. I tried my best to manage without them. My daughter, as I say, was adopted. And then a year and a half later, my physical health had progressed to the point that I was now wheelchair bound and had received a diagnosis of a progressive degenerative genetic condition. I was able to start an out of hours appeal on the basis that I had been complaining about my physical health all the way through the initial case, and that social services hadn't been assessing them. And also that the judge in my initial case had admonished social services several times for not conducting proper assessments. I won my appeal and was told that if social services had conducted all their assessments correctly, there is a possibility I would have been able to retain custody of my child, but we will never know for sure. This judgment was ruled to also be placed in my daughter's file, along with all the other court papers, so that when she's old enough, if she wishes to access her file, she will be able to see this. My daughter has just turned 18, and all the contact that was ordered by the court has been cut because she has said that she no longer wishes to have contact with me. I have no idea when I will ever see her again. I've never been able to have any more children, partly because of my genetic illness, which has a 50% inheritance rate, but partly because I was so frightened of having to go through social services proceedings again and losing another child. I decided that it wouldn't be fair on any partner I was with, and I was not mentally or physically strong enough to be able to live through that again. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much for that, Jean. Thank you. You speak for many mothers, you do. I now like to call on Nathan Mann, who is going to read a speech by a young man who was taken into care as a teenager and is really too traumatized to be on Zoom. Go ahead, Nathan.
I spent several years in my teens in care when I was 15 and a half, but I don't think I will ever recover from the trauma and abuse I suffered. My mother has never hurt me, but I was harmed in care. You would think as a teenager my voice would be heard, but instead I was silenced and locked up in a psychological unit. I was denied access to my friends and family, but also my lawyers, so that I could not appeal my case, and my phone was removed. I spent my 16th birthday alone. 16 and a half, I was sent to an unregulated home for adult drug users. I had no bedding or food, and all the occupants were over 21. My first night became the trauma that I lived every day, and I slept with a knife under my pillow, crying. The police were called daily to serious fights, drug dealing, and stabbings, and I was constantly threatened that staff who were there to protect me ran away. I was terrified. I locked myself in my room for the next year, and I started to suffer panic attacks, which remain with me today. Started to self-harm to numb my pain. My friends were frightened and stopped visiting. I lived on bread and hummus bought on the £10 the social workers gave me weekly. My dad tried to get food to me, but he was threatened that contact would be stopped like they had done with my mum, so I just went hungry. I was denied all medical care and the proper education. When my grandmother died, social workers told me that if I went to her funeral, they would arrest my mum as punishment. I cried alone in my room. At Christmas, social workers refused to allow me a tree or the usual gifts from home. Birthdays were spent alone. I am disabled, and the bathroom had no disabled access. This meant that by the time I managed to get safely home to my mum, I had not had a shower in 2 years. My clothes were covered in fleas. I am now home with my loving mum, where I feel the warmth and love like a normal family. I sleep in a warm bed with sheets and have hot, freshly home-cooked food every day. I love my mum and thank every day that she fought to get me home.
Thank you very much, Nathan. I now like to call on Victoria Childs of the Psychotherapy and Counselling Union, who's a committed member of Support Not Separation. Victoria.
Thanks, Nina. Well, we're absolutely indebted to the authors of this invaluable research, which further validates the experiences of people like the testimony that Nathan just read out, whose shocking experience speaks for itself. And thanks for being so courageous to share all that. At Psychotherapy and Counselling Union, we're a young organisation with over 700 members, which started in 2015. As a trade union, we campaign in solidarity with the people that we work with around the concerns that affect their lives and in turn ours. Many of us work with adults who survived forced separation as children, and we see firsthand the devastating effects. So I myself have worked with people in their 70s and 80s who are still traumatized by the shock of forced separation as children, and whose lives have been informed by the early trauma, by the primary shock and the dissociation and the lifelong aftershocks. Not only does forced early separation affect people in one lifetime, but it creates a transgenerational trauma. That is an energetic imprint of trauma which passes down over generations, catastrophically affecting families and relationships into the whole future of society, and which can last over hundreds of years. As critical psychotherapists, we recognise the shortcomings within our own profession. The family court appointed psychological professionals come into the arena with their own assumptions. Assumptions which are often sexist, racist, classist, and are biased towards those who are able-bodied and have secure immigration statuses. Very few court-appointed psychological professionals have a trauma model related to domestic violence. So, for instance, many are concerned with diagnosing disorders based on a US-style diagnostic and statistical manual, DSM model of diagnosis. Sometimes this is based on 20-minute consultations. And we know from the new report, 76% of women reported domestic violence to the family courts. So the natural trauma of this abuse is being misrecognised as an ever-shifting kind of mirage of erroneous diagnoses of mental illnesses in mothers who speak out. So we would like to see major changes to this system. A system which has been promoting adoption as the gold standard is a system with an apocalyptic infrastructure, one based on short-term thinking, that is, with little regard for the long-term effects which can be so perilous to the whole of society. So we would like to see funding and resources redirected into supporting families to stay together instead of supporting a system which is causing further mental distress. And a care income is the best way of doing this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victoria. Thank you. I now call on Chrissy Amis from Global Women Against Deportation, which brings together groups at the Crossroads Women's Center campaigning against destitution, detention, and deportation, including the All African Women's Group, Legal Action for Women, Women Against Rape, and Women of Color in the Global Women's Strike. Chrissy.
Thank you, Nina. Many of the supporters we work with are destitute and traumatized mothers fighting for status and to stop their kids being taken by the authorities. Some have been in detention, separated from their children and facing deportation back to wars, starvation, dictatorships, and environmental devastation. Several mothers are living with violent men who they cannot report for fear of being detained and deported, sometimes without their kids. One mum has lost custody to her violent partner. Another was threatened with having her kids taken when the family were thrown out of their housing in midwinter during the pandemic. We campaigned and she won rehousing. Even women who win their immigration status in the UK are not safe. A young mother given limited rights to remain was hit with the no recourse to public funds policy, denying her National Health Service healthcare, welfare benefits, housing, legal aid, and many other entitlements. Social services threatened to take her child when she asked for help to buy a school uniform. We helped her fight that. She won her benefits and housing. We're campaigning to get the no recourse to public funds abolished, and that struggle continues. Like other women of colour, asylum-seeking mums and refugees face terrible racism in family courts and from social workers, and that's on top of the sexism all mums face. Women are blamed for our poverty and demeaned, even though making asylum seekers destitute is a deliberate government policy. The UK is infected by toxic, relentless racism. This is starting to come out, but there is much more to be heard from women and children. In the UK, kids of colour are disproportionately stopped and searched, criminalised, 10 times more likely to be taken into care, and are almost 50% of all children held in youth detention. The Black Lives Matter movement helped fire up the anti-racist, inclusive movement, and people are ready to act. So when Asim Brown's mum, Joan, called for help to stop her young autistic teenage son from being deported, hundreds of thousands of people answered that call, and together we won. Like so many justice campaigns, it is the mums, the sisters, the daughters who fight and protect their loved ones. And more people are siding with mothers and children against the government, thanks in part to the footballer Marcus Rashford, shaming politicians who are ready to let working class kids starve. At last, Johnson and Patel are on the back foot, forced to defend their racism. People's anger against governments and what they do is growing everywhere. Fighting to end the separation of children and mothers is a woman's issue, an anti-racist issue, it's a justice issue. It's part of the anti-deportation movement. Together, we can end the vicious attacks on mothers, carers, and our children. We demand every resource we need to build a caring world and together beat the global pandemic of repression. Thank you.
Thank you, Crystal. It is now a great pleasure to call on Dr. Adrian Barnett, who has agreed to speak at our Speak Out. She's a senior lecturer in law at Brunel University, London, who was a family law barrister for over 30 years. And she's the author of the literature review on domestic abuse and private law children cases, which accompanied the government harm report. Please go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, so thank you very much. Amazing speeches so far, my goodness. I hope there's not going to be a lot of barking from my dogs during this 3 minutes. For those in the US, the Ministry of Justice Harm Panel report was published in June last year. The panel received over 1,200 responses from individuals and organisations across England and Wales, and held roundtables and focus groups with professionals, parents and children with experience of the family courts. And the call for evidence was supplemented with the literature review, which I undertook. So the evidence submitted to the panel demonstrates continuing concerns about how the family court system recognises and responds to domestic abuse in private law children proceedings. The submissions highlighted how abuse is systematically minimised, children's voices aren't heard, allegations are ignored, dismissed or disbelieved, risk is inadequately assessed, court processes are traumatic, child arrangements are unsafe, and abusers can exercise continued control through repeat litigation. Victims reported difficulties evidencing abuse, particularly where they encountered stereotypical views of how a typical victim should behave. They found there particular barriers for women of colour and minoritized victims in raising domestic abuse, with victims and professionals supporting them perceived as involving racism, in addition to sexism and class prejudice. As far as outcomes are concerned, the courts almost always ordered some form of contact, frequently unrestricted, and many respondents highlighted the burden placed on mothers and children to comply with contact orders compared to minimal expectations on perpetrators of abuse to change their behaviour. And a number of submissions identified this consequence of the pro-contact culture as a form of entrenched sexism in the family courts. The problems for victims of domestic abuse were exacerbated by various forms of structural advantage and disadvantage. The forms of structural disadvantage that were most commonly raised were lack of legal representation arising from economic disadvantage, being from a Black or minority ethnic background, and living in a rural area. Some participants felt acutely othered and belittled by the court and identified their experience as racism. Mothers and professionals and organizations supporting them perceived that many of the professionals and judges treated allegations with a high level of suspicion, and that there was an element of sexism and class prejudice in the stereotypical assessments of victims and abusers, with the barriers to Black and minoritized women raising domestic abuse multiplied by cultural stereotypes. The panel found that fears of counter-allegations of parental alienation are clearly a barrier to victims of abuse telling the court about their experiences and a means by which children's voices may be disqualified. The panel was told that counter-allegations of parental alienation were sometimes taken seriously, even where there was little or no supporting evidence. The panel found that the strong association between claims of alienation and domestic abuse allegations suggest that accusations of parental alienation are often used to threaten and blame victims of domestic abuse who are attempting to protect their children and achieve safer contact outcomes. Some mothers and support organizations indicated that they felt that the court's approach to allegations of domestic abuse and counter allegations of parental alienation was sexist and discriminatory. If there's time, I'd like to go off-piste a little. Sorry, just find this. And end with some words of advice from the amazing Mara Larissy, MBE, who spoke on the panel at the screening by Brunel University of Rachel Merrick's incredible film, What Doesn't Kill Me. This was in January. For those who aren't familiar with her, Mara Larissy is a consultant community organizer and educator, and has worked in the area of ending violence against women and girls for over 25 years, focusing in particular on marginalized and minoritized women and girls. Until May 2019, she was executive director of IMCAN UK and has been voted one of the world's 100 most influential people in gender policy. So a key issue highlighted by Ms. Larissy was the way in which racism can be deployed, particularly by white men who have Black or global majority women as ex-partners in the family court context to impugn those women's credibility. To what extent, Ms. Larissy asked, are we going to see those women as autonomous human beings who are actually seeking help and seeking justice, and who are reporting an experience of violence, which in and of itself should be seen as valid?
Adrian, I'm sorry. Can I just stop you there? Maybe during the discussion, if you want to add that, or if you want to put it in the chat, I'm sure that will be.
I'll put in the chat the link to the video. Okay. All right. Thank you. I couldn't see you.
Thank you very much. I have to say that the harm report has been extremely helpful to us, and we have been quoting from it ever since. Our next speaker is in fact a video with Amanda Hales and Susie Winter from An Untold Story Voices, which is a collective of women with lived experience of street sex work in Hull and their supporters, whom we first met through the English collective of prostitutes who are also part of the Support Not Separation Coalition. I hope it works. Yes, it's coming on.
As a young mum, I struggled with poverty. I struggled with domestic abuse and childhood trauma and adult trauma, and I felt like I couldn't cope. I was struggling, but nobody would seem to support me. I tried talking to my doctor, he put me on antidepressants, and my life just lurched along, and I started pushing down my trauma and my pain and my emptiness with prescription tablets and then street drugs, cracking heroin. And I was in desperate need for support, and no matter who I turned to, I couldn't get that support. Because I was an addict, they wouldn't give me mental health treatment. So I was in a catch-22. I knew I was pushing down my trauma with drugs, but yet they wouldn't let me speak about my trauma. It got to the stage where I was in crisis and I had my children removed from my custody. I didn't feel like I could fight for them to return because they went to family, and I didn't want to fight my family when they were helping me. That I was in crisis, and I just didn't know what to do, and my children were removed from my custody and my life spiralled out of control. What I'm saying is, women need support. They don't need their children removing. I should have had support, and I didn't, and I lost everything, and I still feel the shame and the guilt today.
Okay, right. I first experienced losing my child to social services at the tender age of 19, 20. He was 4-year-old when he first went into care. It was because I was addicted to drugs at the time. He was taken into the local authorities' care. He spent 9 years in care, and I eventually got myself together, my act together. I stopped taking drugs, got into a steady relationship, and got my son home. How I feel about getting him home, I thought it was an amazing achievement because I'd actually signed his adoption papers when he was first gone into care. You know, I didn't think I had the ability to get my act together, my life together, in order to get him back, but, you know, I proved them all wrong. I stood my ground and eventually, you know, did all the right things, got down the right path and got him home. What helped me with social services is knowing the system and knowing what they do and knowing, you know, how to play along with what the things they want you to do and the hoops they want you to jump through. Because there is hoops, bigger hoops, and they get bigger as you're trying to succeed, you know, in getting on with your life. So it's an achievement and a half to be able to get your child home from social services care.
Thank you very much for that. Now, I've got Michael Coleman from Payday Men's Network, who's a former social worker, and he's also part of Support Not Separation. Michael.
Unmute. Okay, you can hear me now.
Yes, we can hear you a bit muffled. Try again.
Okay, I'll speak close to the mic. I'm a father, a former social worker, and a former children's home worker. And I used to help look after 2 young sisters in a children's home. The girls were killed by their father. It is unimaginable. In another children's home, the man in charge was caught sexually abusing a teenage girl. His punishment was to work in another children's home. 3/4 of children's homes are now privatized. They can charge over £200,000 a year for a single placement, and they are barely monitored. When the risk of being abused or neglected in care is so great, why is this not taken into account when social workers make their decisions. As a social worker, I work mainly with single mothers on low incomes and benefits. Most social workers I work with did not prioritize getting money and other resources to mothers to prevent children coming into care. Shockingly, over 50% of children from the poorest communities are referred to children's services before they are 5 years old. Poverty has become the excuse for mass social engineering and mass surveillance. My training never included learning about the trauma a child will suffer as a result of being taken from mother, siblings, and all that is familiar. I raised this with former social worker Emma Llewellyn-Book, the MP, when she was Shadow Education Minister responsible for children and families. She agreed the trauma of separation was not part of her social work training. In Support Not Separation, we've seen time and again how men who are hostile and violent to former partners and children accuse mothers of making up allegations in order to alienate children from fathers. I want to tell you, parental alienation is the brainchild of Richard Gardner, a US psychiatrist who dismissed domestic violence, defended pedophilia, and advocated that children should be forced to have contact with fathers regardless of any risk to their lives. The World Health Organization has refused to recognize this much discredited theory, but CAFCAS and the family courts have not dismissed parental alienation, and the Fathers Lobby promotes it. Organizations like Dads Unlimited, Men's Aid, Justice for Men and Boys, and Families Need Fathers. Backed up by Tory MP Philip Davis, who tried to derail anti-violence legislation, has spoken at conferences that have promoted rape denial and have given a platform to white nationalists, Islamophobes, and male supremacists. Many men do want to look after and care for our children and recognize that most of the primary caring work is done by mothers, and that we must respect that, including during a breakup. We need to speak out in support of women and children and publicly oppose violent fathers and their organizations. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Michael is also a regular at our monthly picket. Okay, it is now a great pleasure to call on our speakers from the US who have joined Support Not Separation with their organizations. And I start with Phoebe Jones from the Global Women's Strike in Philadelphia and Every Mother is a Working Mother Network. Phoebe.
Our work on child welfare began in 2006 when we stumbled upon two women protesting outside the Department of Human Services, DHS, against the unjust removal of their children. We joined and expanded their weekly protests, and it soon became clear that many women in our network, mothers on low income, mainly women of color, were making a similar but hidden struggle. We pulled together a self-help support group we called DHS Give Us Back Our Children to fight cases and expose the sexist and racist removals. We put out an award-winning video of our experiences. We were soon joined by our sisters in Los Angeles, who also formed a group. Together, we got breakthroughs in the press. The press had previously only reported on the few cases where children died at the hands of their parents, mainly fathers and stepfathers, but not on the thousands devastated and traumatized by being taken from their mothers, grandmothers, and aunties, nor on the abuse and deaths of children in state institutions and foster care. The mothers-led movement has grown enormously since, creating a radical shift in awareness of this issue. It has been helped by the outcry at the separation and detention of children crossing the US-Mexico border under Trump, the Black Lives Matter movement against structural racism, and the movement of prisoners and formerly incarcerated people. Mothers are pointing out that the war on drugs used to imprison men of color is also used to criminalize women and to massively remove and forcibly adopt children. Philadelphia and Los Angeles trade places as having the worst record on child removal of all the large cities. But there are victories. In some places, the opening of courts, there was a group in Philly that got a judge fired who was particularly bad on child welfare. And also in Philly, a special committee was finally convened by Philadelphia City Council to investigate the high rate of child removals, which includes Richard Wexler of the National Coalition of Child Protection Reform, who has campaigned on this for decades and with whom we work. Since welfare reform, introduced by President Clinton and passed by Congress in 1997, it targeted mothers, especially mothers of color. And since then, the money spent on the privatized child removal industry has risen by 20,000%, from 25 million to 5 billion, instead of that money going to mothers. Now, many demands are being made, including to dismantle the child welfare system, to fund community organizations and lawyers to defend mothers, and for the abolition of the Adoption and Safe Families Act. But the real question is, will mothers and other family caregivers who have been impoverished for decades get the money we need and are entitled to? Children's lives matter, and they matter first of all to their mothers and families who love and fight for them. We are campaigning for newly introduced child tax credits to go directly to mothers and other primary caregivers, and for a care income that recognizes and raises the status of caring. Poverty is not neglect. As the massive Poor People's Campaign we are also part of says, take away our poverty, not our children. Only then will we break the stranglehold of the state's subsidized industries that feed off criminalization and child removal. Thank you.
Thank you, Phoebe. Thank you for that history, important history. And now, Carolyn Hill from Women of Color in the Global Women's Strike and DHS Give Us Back Our Children, who fought for her nieces, with Phoebe and others. Go ahead, Carolyn.
Hi, I'm Carolyn Hill. I work with the Women of Color in the Global Women's Strike. And DHS Give Us Back Our Children. DHS put 2 toddler nieces in my home for a year. Child advocate said that they were doing well with me, happier than they ever seen them. I was on the track of adopting them, then DHS switched agencies. That agency didn't like me, maybe because I was a young, low-income housing. They took my nieces one day in the middle of dinner with no warning. They told the courts it was because I had mental issues, I was being evicted, and had financial problems, none of which was true. Also, that I didn't have a GED or diploma, school diploma. They did not give me a lawyer. They did not tell me I could appeal. I fought back. I went to the Philadelphia newspaper, the Daily News. The Daily News sent me to Crossroads Women's Center, where DHS Give Us Back Our Children was based, which helped me fight my case. Do the paperwork, get the media, put a pill in, and finally get a lawyer. I got support by my church, family, friends, and elected officers. Over 35 family members signed the petition saying that they wanted me to have the girls. DHS psych evaluation saw me for less than a half an hour and said she didn't test, but she didn't test me. She didn't do the things that she said she did and wasn't capable of taking care of kids. I fought for and won an independent psych eval, which saw me and the children for several hours over 5 days. They say there was no problem with me having the girls. We took the case all the way up to the Superior Court where we lost. They had 3 lawyers compared to my one. The courts rubber stamped DHS. They had each other's back and they wouldn't let my supporters testify. And my lawyer was cozy with the other lawyers and didn't fight for me. Finally, they sent my nieces to a more distant family member with more money, but no connections with the family. The children haven't seen me or the rest of the family since 2013. Now, because President Biden, American Relief Plan, I will get $750 a month in child tax credit for my 3 grandchildren who I take care of. If I had that money back in 2011, they would not have said I was too poor to take care of the children. I'm fighting to get a new child tax credit made permanent and go directly to mothers, primary caregivers like me. Thank you for giving me a chance to tell my story.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. We learned a lot from working on your case with you for all that time. Our next speaker is Sydney Ross Risden from Every Mother is a Working Mother Network and Global Women's Strike LA, who will announce their self-help guide. Go ahead, Sydney.
Thanks, everybody. I'm with the Every Mother is a Working Mother Network and work with DCFS Give Us Back Our Children in Los Angeles. As Phoebe said, LA County has the largest child welfare system in the US and alternates with Philly in removing the highest children at the highest rate. Disproportionately Black, Indigenous, and Latinx children. When we started in 2009, we found that navigating LA's Department of Children and Family Services and Children's Court was like being in a maze with almost no information on what comes next or what your rights are, while families are confronted by hostile and/or overworked social workers and lawyers. Our booklet, Know Your Rights, What to Do If Your Child is Detained by DCFS, is a map created by families who've been through LA's child welfare system to assist others caught up in it. Planning Know Your Rights, those with experience fighting to get their own children back first developed a list of questions that families caught in this system need answers to, and then collectively drafted answers, pooling our practical experience. Then we fact-checked it with lawyers and advocates. But first, it came from women who've been through the child welfare system. And it grew from our original idea of a 3-page Know Your Rights sheet to becoming a 34-page booklet in both English and Spanish. We raise up the name of the late Ruth Tedasco, who initially coordinated the Know Your Rights work. The purpose of the Know Your Rights booklet is for mothers, grandmas, and other primary caregivers to be armed with easily available information they need to navigate and challenge the child welfare system as they fight to bring their children home. Also to bring public awareness to child welfare abuses and be a power in efforts to fundamentally end the child welfare system as we know it. Next Tuesday, July 20th at 4, we'll launch the online publication of our bilingual Know Your Rights booklet as part of the webinar, Stop Stealing Our Children, Take Away Our Poverty, Not Our Children. We really hope you can join us. We'll put the link to register in the chat. We look forward to joining efforts with the Support Not Separation Network that is expanding from the UK to include us in the US. We all need the power of each other in this growing national and international movement, campaigning for money and other resources to be made available, first of all, to mothers. It's central to keeping families together. Thanks.
Thank you, Cindy. We very much look forward to your webinar. I now call on Sabrine Adiba from DSFS Give Us Back Our Children in California and the grandmother. Go ahead, Sabrina.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you very well. Go ahead.
Okay, my name is Sabrina Deba, and as you know, I am a member of DCFS, Give Us Back Our Children. I became caregiver for my baby granddaughter, placed with me by DCFS upon her and her mother's release from the hospital. Her 19-year-old mother, my daughter, who was living with me at the time of the baby's birth, was told by DCFS that she could no longer live in my residence with her baby. She was forced into homelessness. Although I was very poor during this time that my granddaughter was placed in my care, I loved her dearly. And as she blossomed, we became so bonded. Any onlooker would have thought I had carried her in my womb. I was the first person she called mama. My granddaughter continued to be under the supervision of DCFS and Children's Court. When I began to question the moral code of DCFS, who told lies about me to the judge at Children's Court, I was treated like an unruly slave. I was humiliated for being poor, although DCFS never provided medical or cash aid for the baby, despite knowing I was on a fixed income. I jumped through hoops DCFS held for me, yet I still lived under the constant threat of having my only joy taken and put in the system for fast-track adoptions. My granddaughter was 14 months old when she was unjustly taken from me by DCFS and given to her maternal aunt. Even after this aunt passed away when my granddaughter was 5 years old. Excuse me, 5 years old. I was still denied custody as her maternal grandmother. DCFS eventually arranged for my granddaughter to be adopted by a great aunt in another county whom she didn't know well, but who had more resources. I am not allowed to see her at all. The bond I shared with my granddaughter became a threat to her adopting family. Being separated from the grandmother she loved, my granddaughter, who is now 12 years old, still suffers from PTSD. That's why I'm committed to working as part of DCFS. Give Us Back Our Children. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabrina. These are the people who are making decisions for the welfare of our children, and these are the decisions they make. Thank you very much. Margaret Prescott is our final speaker from Black Women for Wages for Housework and Women of Color in the Global Women's Strike. She's also founder of Every Mother is a Working Mother Network and a host with Pacifica Radio Sojourner Truth programs. Margaret.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You're hearing me okay? Yes?
Fine, go ahead.
All righty. Well, what an outpouring of truth and the torture of children and their moms put through an innocent sounding name of child welfare or child protective services. Well, from what we have heard, it just underscores that what we know, which is that poverty in all its forms is violence, and that snatching children away from their mothers is a form of child abuse. It is a torture of mothers. So we're really glad that you're shedding light on this epidemic. It is an epidemic across the United States and in the UK, both sides of the Atlantic. And as Nina said earlier, child snatching by state or state entities is not new. It has a torturous history. Nina pointed out about Argentina and Latin America and other parts of the world. We certainly know in Europe and Ireland during Cromwell, when they were ethnically cleansing Ireland of the Irish and sending some of those mothers to Barbados, which is where I hail from. And Nina also spoke about the indigenous children who were, those who weren't killed were sent to boarding schools to rid them of their culture. And also during slavery, where children were separated from their mothers and sold, and where women were forced to be breeders to have children, and men were forced to be studs to impregnate enslaved women. So this control of women, control of mothers, control of our bodies has a long history. And indeed, during the slave days, one of the so-named founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, he said, well, it's okay because these slaves, they don't feel pain and they don't have the capacity to grieve. And that's how they justified it. But if you go into any children's court, I'm sure this is true in the UK, also in the United States, you see the tears of the children, you see the heartbreak of the mothers, the grandmothers, the aunties like Sabrine and Carolyn, all of those who spoke so beautifully today. In planning the event that Sydney referred to, that we're doing in Los Angeles to launch our Know Your Rights booklet, we have come together with formerly incarcerated women and women who are or have been residents at a transitional home for women, some of whom were domestic violence victims or who were unhoused, homeless. Some of the demands coming out of our discussions are very much in line with testimony given today. And I just want to highlight a few of those, if that would be okay, Nina. As several speakers have said, we definitely want to expand the Support Not Separation Network beyond the UK to include the United States. Others have talked about the care income for mothers, how central that is. We hear again and again in our work that foster mothers get money from the government, but mothers who have given birth to children, primary caregivers, grandmothers like Sabrine, don't. So we know that if we're not talking about demanding, actively campaigning for money for mothers, we are frankly not going to get rid of this scourge of children being taken into detention, this state kidnapping of our children. And that's the reason we titled our event, Stop Stealing Our Children, Take Away Our Poverty, Not Our Children. Some of what has come out is that we want to stop the practice of mothers being thrown out of low-income housing. I don't know if that happens in the UK. It does in the US. If your child is detained, you're in low-income housing, they throw you out. And that makes it very difficult, of course, to get your children back. Also, children are detained because their mothers are victims of domestic violence. We have to halt that practice in California and New York. They had a lawsuit and won. Another thing we're finding across the country is that they're drug testing low-income mothers who are in hospital to give birth. And if any positive comes up, whether it's from a prescription, a little marijuana or whatever, the hospital calls Child Protective Services and the baby is taken from the mothers right there in the hospital. We want to stop that practice. Also, stop the practice of placing mothers who have had their children taken by the government on child welfare abuse lists. I don't know if you have that in the UK, but it certainly is something we're finding across the United States. And that follows you the rest of your life. It means if you want to get a little job in a daycare center or whatever, working with children, you're not allowed to have happen. Also, back to President Clinton again, Phoebe mentioned the welfare reform that he put into place that took away our right to welfare. And I'll have to say that welfare rights movement was a movement, it was a women's movement that Selma James always reminds us of. And it was a movement demanding money for the care of our children. And that's one of the reasons they wanted to undermine that welfare rights movement. Of course, the Wages for Housework campaign, marking 50 years next year, has been campaigning on this whole issue of money for mothers. But one of the things we want to do, a lot of people don't know about Clinton's fast track adoption bill. It's been devastating when it comes to child welfare. Where in some states like Wisconsin, you could lose parental rights after just 15 months for formerly incarcerated mothers, women. This is a crisis across the country. If a detained child is 3 years or younger, the clock starts ticking immediately, so that if the mother doesn't meet all of the criteria given by the courts to get her children back, that mother loses parental rights. The other thing that we are demanding and working on, we're actively supporting Congresswoman Gwen Moore. Congresswoman Gwen Moore, a Black woman out of also Milwaukee, Wisconsin. She was on welfare. When she was on welfare, they took her 2 children. She had to fight them back. She's now a US Congresswoman, and she has legislation entitled Poverty is Not Neglect. She also has another piece of legislation that we're supporting that redefines work to include unpaid caregivers and students and demanding resources and money for them. So, thank you for just allowing me to share this with you, and to know, I'll just, end by this. I'm an example of a child who refused to leave.
Your sound got cut off.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Is my sound back? Yes. Example is a child who refused to leave my impoverished family in Barbados to live with relatives in the US who offered a better life. That's what they did with Sabrine. That's what they did with Carolyn, to say we replace you with family members who have more resources. I preferred to live in poverty with my mother, with my family, because the bond between a mother and a child is not considered whatsoever. It sounds from the child welfare system in the UK as well as in the US. So we really have to come together. I'm glad that we're building this network across the Atlantic. Very happy to say, as Phoebe mentioned, we have some victories today. Checks are going to 32 million families across the United States in child tax credits. And just today, the US Treasury, Secretary of the Treasury, Yellen, she just demanded and asked that the child tax credits be made permanent. It's something that we're also working on. And for those of us in the National Welfare Rights Union, as Maureen Taylor says, we're not interested in moving forward. We're not interested in moving forward with people who just look like me, but with people who act like me. And we're demanding a care income on top of a basic income. Thank you so very much for this, and look forward to all of us working together on all of these demands and additional demands that you might have.
Thank you very much, Margaret, for summing up we stand for, all of us on both sides of the Atlantic. We're all survivors in one way or another of a long and gory story, which is increasingly coming out. And we're building a movement for justice, and this is what this Speak Out today is all about. For our children, for mothers, to end the poverty of mothers, because there would be no child poverty if mothers were not poor. So I now like to ask people, I know there's quite a few comments have been put in the chat. If people have questions, please. If you have a case, you should email us. And remember to look at the self-help guide, which is now online. And also remember that we're not lawyers and we're based on self-help. So are there any questions to any of us, any of the speakers? Can you please put it in the chat, and we'll see to answer.
Do you want me to flag up some of the forthcoming things in the meantime?
I don't see any questions coming up at the moment, so maybe we should flag up some of the things that are coming up just now, and I will ask Anne to do that.
Okay, so there are a few things in the pipeline. One of them is that there's a social care review which is going on at the moment. It's looking at what happens when children are looking at the whole, everything that happens to children in care. And if you're interested, Tracy will put a link in, because they are taking evidence with a deadline of the 13th of August. They've issued an initial report which has some very good information in it, including about the level of privatization of children's services and the amount of money that's getting spent. But keeping in mind that the person who's running it was told at the very beginning that there wouldn't be too many resources. So we don't know where it's going, but it is open for comments with a deadline of the 13th of August. So people might want to look out for that. You should also know, you've probably seen that there's been a big movement to get an adoption apology. And Harriet Harman, who's an MP who chairs the Human Rights Committee, is taking evidence about historic adoptions. And we've been pressing her and lobbying and saying adoptions are not only historic, they're happening every day. And we want that. We want women whose children are being adopted to be able to give evidence to her committee. And you could write to Harriet Harman directly, and the information about that is on our blog. I think it's been mentioned already that there's going to be a big Channel 4 dispatches report about the family court, which will be next Tuesday. So that's an opportunity for us to, you know, for there to be more publicity and for more evidence to be coming out. And finally, there's just to keep an eye on the Family Justice Panel, which is supposed to be looking at the presumption of contact and some of the other issues that came out from the harm report, which we've talked about. We don't know where it's going, but it's worth keeping an eye out. And Tracy will also put that in the link so that people can find out more about that. Oh, and our Twitter storm is always on the first Wednesday of every month. We always picketed outside the family court directly, but during COVID, it's been a Twitter storm. So it's always on the first Wednesday. It's between 12:30 and 1:30. And we tweet out what's the latest news about what's really happening in the family courts. Everybody's welcome to join us. Our Twitter handle is @NotSeparation. And we do hope that in September, we'll be able to be back outside the Central Family Court in London. And if you're in other places and you're interested in having a picket outside your family court, please do get in touch, because we'd love to talk about that and spread the word about the pickets, because they do really offer an opportunity to speak out about what's really going on behind the closed doors of the secret family court.
Great, that's great, Anne. Now, I wonder if there are any questions that people want answers to. I see that all the links are being put in the chat. So if you want to be involved in putting pressure on Harriet Harman, or joining the picket, or starting your own picket, you know, we really want to expand the picket so it's not only in London, but it's all over the country. And in fact, we would love if the US at some point has the forces to start pickets in your cities. That would be great. The pickets have been very effective.
That's one of the proposals coming from the LA planning group, is to do regular pickets, and it would be good to coordinate it. Children's Court.
That would be excellent, because, you know, the pickets have been really successful. First of all, they can hear you inside the court, and we've had comments from judges saying, you know, that I can't remember what they said, but they made reference to our picket. And also we meet a lot of mothers who are up in court on that day, and many who have then come to our self-help sessions at the Women's Center, and some who have been helped. and have gone on to win their cases. So they've been really, really successful. And of course, you just stay in touch with what's really going on a day-to-day basis, which is so important. So it'd be great to have pickets in the US. I don't know if anybody who's monitoring the chat has noticed any questions. Tracy, if you see the questions, maybe you can raise them.
I can, or Eric can, if you're there, Eric.
Hi, can you hear me?
What would be your general advice on how mothers, victims should do?
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes. Sorry, I see a question on Kafka's here. I think with something like that, it would be good if you wrote to us. Because it's and looked in the also look in the self-help guide. The self-help guide is full of fabulous tips about how to deal with the child guardian, how to deal with your lawyer, how to deal with the social workers. So the first step is really to look at that, and then you can write to us and you can join our self-help. Anything else?
Nina, there's a question. How do you counter allegations of parental alienation when psychologists have been involved?
Do you want to answer that, Tracy?
Sure. I mean, I would mirror what Nina just said about looking in our self-help guide. We do put a section under private law where we do talk about how to manage psychologists and parental assessments, because there are quite a lot of tactics that you can use. And I really suggest that you look there, because there's quite a lot we could say, but it would take probably the rest of the time to answer that question. But please look in our self-help guide. There is a whole section on this.
I see, hold on. I see there's also a question here about, is it really best not to mention domestic abuse? I've been told I will lose my kids if I mention abuse again. That is a very standard advice by lawyers who really are not on your side. And we have won cases on abuse. So I don't know, Tracy or Nicola, if you want to comment briefly on that.
It is absolutely a standard question by lawyers. And we say from the start that you gather your evidence and raise your evidence. Please, whatever you do, raise it from the start. If you're going to raise it, you must raise it from the start. Do not suddenly raise it in the middle of your case, because that is the point that they will accuse you of parental alienation. At all points, you must raise your abuse and what happened right from the very beginning. Nicola?
Yes, I saw that question and I was wanting to quickly touch on that. No, you absolutely should raise the domestic abuse. It's knowing what to say, when to say it, and how to say it, sadly, because it's very true that your allegations will often be dismissed or ignored, or you'll be accused of lying. But the most important thing is to know, if you've got evidence, make sure that you give it all to your lawyer. Keep on top of your lawyer, and don't if you're not happy with something, don't ever go along with it because you feel like you have to. I mean, all of this is in the self-help guide, but I do believe that yes, you should definitely raise the violence. It's just knowing how to do it and when.
Remember that you are in charge of your case, not your lawyers, and they don't always give you the best advice. So please refer to our self-help guide if they've given you some advice that you think is not in your best interests.
Yeah, and you can turn cases around. Don't feel despondent or despairing, because there's always things that you find, things that you can do. And you know, the mums meetings are great examples of them, because you know, there are mums that come that have won their cases that can then say, well, actually, look, I was in your shoes a year ago and I felt like giving up, and I felt like nobody was ever going to take me seriously, and I was going to lose my children, or I couldn't protect them. And you know, you can turn it back around. And it's a real fight. It's a struggle. You know it is. You've already been going through it already. But with the right support, we can really, really fight back and win. And we are fighting back and winning. So
we are.
Yeah.
Nina.
Yes,
could I just add that, you know, the same situation is for women seeking asylum from rape and other torture. They face exactly the same disbelief, the same hostility from their lawyers, you know, and it's the, you know, for all of us as women, it's a life and death situation if you cannot get your lawyer to take your case properly, or if they themselves damage and sabotage your case, you know. So that advice that we've just been given applies across the board. So if there's anybody on the webinar tonight who has an issue with their immigration status, which is also affecting their right to keep their children, then there's also a self-help guide published by Legal Action for Women called it's gone out of my head, but it's somebody maybe could put the link to it in the in the chat. And just one other thing, which is more of an announcement, I thought you might be also raising the webinar that we've got coming up, Global Women Against Deportations, next Tuesday, 20th of July, from 12 o'clock midday till 1:30. It's called Up from Destitution, and it's women and children escaping persecution, war and devastation have a right to asylum and support. So it'd be really good if anybody wants to come. We'll post the link to the registration for the event for Eventbrite. Thanks, Nina.
Thank you, Crystal, for announcing it. I was going to, but I'm delighted you did. Okay, now there's a question here about, have you found that the courts have taken the harm report on board? No, they haven't. They really haven't. And in fact, what's happened is that instead of looking at the recommendations of that report, what they then did was to call another review into the whole issue of what is it called? Presumption of contact, which is something that we lobbied on with the domestic abuse bill when it was going through Parliament. We wanted the presumption of contact for violent fathers, especially unsupervised contact, to be abolished, and they wouldn't put it in the bill. So that takes me to another question here about the domestic abuse bill and whether it's going to make a difference. Well, we don't think it's going to make much of a difference because some crucial issues like the one about presumption of contact are not in it, because resources for women who are victims of domestic violence are also not in it, because the no recourse to public funds for immigrant women, which there was a very strong campaign to get that dropped from legislation so that immigrant women could have the same protection that other women have, which is not great, but it's certainly better than nothing. They would not put it in the bill. So I would say no, we don't think it's going to make much of a difference. I don't know if anybody from Women Against Rape in particular who did a lot of lobbying on this, if you want to add anything on it.
I think one of the biggest issues is that the domestic abuse bill is going to be gender neutral, which means we're going to have a real fight on our hands. I think it was last year or quite recently, a refuge had all its money taken away because it was women only, and it was their money was given to, you know, an organisation that, you know, worked with men and women victims of domestic violence. We did so much lobbying on so much of it, but the thing is, you know, I don't think it's going to make much of a difference, and that is really a problem. But what we're doing that we know that works will make a difference to people's cases, to women's cases. I really do believe that. And I think sometimes what you have to think is, you know, you might lose a battle, okay, but you've got to think about eventually you will win the war. And that goes with your individual cases as well. You know, you might have to concede some things that you really don't want to, and we don't think are right, because we know how unjust the courts are. But you have to look at the longer picture and think, right, okay, I'm here and I want to get to there. I might have to do a few things along the way I don't want to do, but it's going to be better for me in the long run. And, you know, we could have had a lot more support with the domestic abuse bill. We haven't got it, but we can still keep fighting and winning.
I see there's another, thank you, Nicola. I see there's a question here about parental alienation and when it became something that was used against mothers. And an answer was put up that it was in the 1980s in the US. It was later here, but you know, a lot of the policies here have very much followed the US. So that's what they're now using. And we managed, actually, that was one important victory. Some MPs, some laws actually, were trying to put parental alienation, if you can believe this, as part of the definition of domestic abuse, which means that you as a mother were going to become labeled as a domestic abuser if the father of the children, the violent father of the children, accused you of parental alienation. So he wouldn't be the abuser. You, the mother trying to protect your children, would become the abuser, according to the definition of the law. And thankfully, we were strong enough to avoid that, so it has not been included in the legislation, although we're still fighting about how the legislation is going to be implemented. So that's an important thing to watch out and to support us on.
I'm sorry, may I speak, please? Sorry, my name is Helen Ross. I'm a mother who has just finished a master's in international law. I'm currently about to start a
Sorry, can you just put your comment or whatever you want to say in the comments, please?
Apologies.
That's all right. We're very glad to be in touch with you. Sorry, it's just that we only have 3 minutes to the end of the meeting. So any crucial... Okay, I see Adrian Barnett. Thank you, Adrian. You has just put an explanation about parental alienation. And says it really took off in 2016 when CAFCAS included it in a new high conflict practice pathway. I remember, in fact, seeing the front line of the Guardian on parental alienation and CAFCAS saying that they were going to use that to take children away. And these are the people who are supposed to be speaking for children, you know, the children's guardians. That's how serious it is. Yes, families need fathers, thank you. And families need fathers who Michael mentioned, and the fathers lobby generally, which is a lobby of domestic violence deniers and male supremacists who have been attacking mothers and the rights of children to refuse to see violent fathers now for decades, have had a massive impact and are really embedded in CAFCAS and the family courts, and are good friends with the head of the family courts, which is absolutely scandalous. So much work needs to be done. But we've run out of time, and I want to thank everybody for taking part in this Speak Out. I'm sorry you've had to put up with 20 speakers, but I hope that it's worked out. It was difficult to handle so many speakers, especially on Zoom, but there was nobody we wanted to turn down. It's fantastic that we're now working more closely with the US, that it's a UK-US coalition, and as a result, we will be much stronger in the many trials to come. So please stay in touch. We're building a movement for justice, led by mothers who are up in the family courts defending our children. You have the guide, you have the address of support, not separation. You can join our self-help meetings if you need to, and you can certainly join our pickets. And don't forget the webinar in the US on the 20th, where they're launching their guide, and also the Global Women Against Deportation webinar on the same day. Thank you very much for attending. Oh, yes. I'm sorry. My memory is terrible. I want to announce this book, which is just being published this month, which is Our Time Is Now, Sex, Race, Class, and Caring for People and Planet by Selma James. Wages for Housework has been mentioned. Selma James is the founder of the Wages for Housework campaign and the founder of our Women's Center. And really the person who started much of what we have built collectively at this Women's Center and internationally as the Global Women's Strike. So the book is available. Somebody's putting the link. Please get it, and please tell us what you think of it. Thank you very much. Our time is now in more ways than one. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Yeah, great event. Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Great event. Thank you.
Bye.